Hello and welcome. Thanks for joining our UQ ChangeMakers webinar series. I'm your host, Anita Heiss, author and Professor of Communications here at the University of Queensland. These are very special events with equally special guests that include you, alumni from around the globe, and of course our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Debbie Terry, and her guests, as well as leading UQ academics. They're all here to talk about the trending issues that are important to you.
One small thing I can do to make a better future is caring for nature and not using so much plastic.
No putting rubbish on the ground over the streets.
We don't litter. Plant more trees.
Turn off the lights when it's day and open the curtains.
Take shorter showers or pick up rubbish on the floor and put it in the bin, or just little things.
I can help encourage my family to recycle and use reusable containers.
Write a letter to the government and big companies so they'll take it seriously.
I think that other people can change the world that I grew up in by also, like me, recycling or maybe using the car less often, and for example with racism and discrimination, think what they will do to other people's lives.
I hope the Earth will be clean in 10 years' time.
I think if we all work together we can make a sustainable future.
Welcome everyone to our second Changemaker event of 2020. How can you join Australian leaders fighting the sustainability crisis? On this webcast tonight, I'm excited to say we are joined by UQ alumni in 59 countries from around the globe. On behalf of UQ, I'd like to say in my own Wiradjuri language, Marangiriya, Yinjumaradu, Mianjingu, Mangu. Good evening, and I pay my respects to the traditional owners of country here in Mianjin, Brisbane, where I'm speaking to you from this evening. In tonight's event, we're hearing from 4 UQ experts and alumni on the sustainability crisis. You'll hear from our speakers. Sustainability is broader than just the environment. It's about living in a way that takes the future into account. It's about balance and compromise and understanding that the actions we take now will impact those who follow. This long-term approach has 3 integrated pillars to sustainable development: economy, society and environment. Or more informally, profit, people and planet. As we continue to see extreme weather events and natural disasters across the world, the impetus for change is here. Now is the time to come together and create change more than ever before. Tonight, to answer some of the big sustainability questions, we're joined by 4 leaders in the UQ community. Professor Debbie Terry, Mick Wilkes, Brooke Williams and Jane Hunter. As I'm sure many of you will know already, Debbie is UQ's new Vice-Chancellor. She's also Chair of the Board of Universities Australia and an appointed member of the ARC Advisory Council, among many, many other roles. Mick is a mining engineer with 35 years experience in precious and base metals across Asia and Australia. He was President and CEO of Oceana Gold Corporation from 2011 to 2020 and was previously the Executive General Manager of Operations at Oz Minerals. And he's also a member of UQ's Sustainable Mining Industry Advisory Board. Jane is CEO of Tritium, a Brisbane-based global leader in the design and manufacture of fast DC chargers for electric vehicles, holding roughly 90% of the Australian market share. Prior to moving to Tritium, Jane was Chief Operating Officer for Boeing's International Advanced Technology arm. Brooke is a UQ PhD candidate researching conservation ecology with a focus on global change and spatial conservation planning. In 2018, she was UQ She was a UQ Global Scholar, and she joins us tonight all the way from Brazil. Welcome everyone, and thank you for being here tonight.
Thanks, Anita.
I'd like to hear from you first, Brooke, if I may, about your perspective on sustainability as someone who has dedicated their career to it. Why did you choose to study and work in conservation, and why is research like yours so important?
Thanks, Anita. Those kids were super cute. So I actually started off studying music and traveling around a little bit, but I didn't feel like I was contributing too much or working towards the things that I really cared about. And I'd always been really interested in biodiversity in the environment. So I came to UQ and started studying a Bachelor of Science, majoring in zoology and ecology. And it was through these courses that I was introduced to the idea that working in conservation was even a job. So through my bachelor, I learned about all of the sustainability issues that we're facing. And it quickly became clear to me that protecting the natural environment is pretty much the most important thing you can do because humanity's persistence depends on it. So for me, working towards creating a sustainable future where humans can thrive seemed like a really exciting career option. And I was also super lucky because I joined a great lab and was continuously encouraged and presented with opportunities from the academics that are here working in the top of their fields in conservation science. And maybe not many people know this, but UQ is actually ranked #1 for biodiversity conservation research in the world. So my supervisors, the ones that are based at UQ, are Professor James Watson, who's the science director for the Wildlife Conservation Society, which is one of the biggest conservation NGOs in the world. And he's also the director of the Center of Biodiversity and Conservation Science here at UQ. And my other UQ-based supervisor is Hawthorne Bayer, who's the science director of the International Institute for Sustainability Australia, which is a research institute aimed at solving tough sustainability problems, particularly with the policy relevance. So I've been so lucky to have them constantly presenting me with important ideas and opportunities. And in answer to your final question, or the second part of that question, in my opinion, research like mine is important for two reasons. Firstly, to make sure that we understand how we're changing Earth and what the implications of this change are for biodiversity and people. And second is to develop solutions to sustainability problems. So for example, how can you plan or manage a landscape better so that biodiversity and ecosystem services, which are those services that nature provides us for free, like carbon sequestration and clean air, are protected, but other objectives such as producing agriculture are also achieved?
Thank you, Brooke. There certainly is reason to be hopeful with students like you. I'd like to turn now to Mick. Mick, you have decades of experience in this space. When you were at OceanaGold, you actively built a company culture focused on minimising environmental impact and creating a socially sustainable work environment. What did this look like in practice, and why was it a priority for you?
Oh, thanks, Anita, and thanks for the opportunity to be on this panel to discuss such an important topic. Since I left Queensland Uni with as a Bachelor of Mining Engineering in 1984, I've been very proud of the involvement I've had in the industry, building projects both in Australia and overseas. And the philosophy that I've taken to this is really asking yourself why we do what we do. Why do we dig stuff up and turn it into metals, gold, copper, iron ore, whatever? And it's not just about extracting resources from the ground. It's really about the holistic picture of creating a better world for people and creating a better society. So what we are really doing is we're turning what's in the ground, our resources, into human capital. So society has to benefit and people have to benefit from this. And this has been going on for centuries. What's changing is the expectations of society and the pressures on our planet from an environmental perspective. And we in the mining industry need to adapt and adjust and meet and indeed exceed those expectations of society in the future. You know, I like to talk about a future of the mining industry where no one works underground by 2050, because that's an expectation of our society that we should embrace to remove the hazards that involve with that. And similarly, we should embrace the zero emissions targets of 2050 as set out by numerous governments around the world. And they are targets that can be achieved through people, through technology and through proper investment. I think I'm very proud to be part of an industry that can contribute significantly to these future challenges. And I've always said to people that I've worked with, in particular when we were building Oceana Gold, good people work for good companies. You know, investors invest in good companies. Other companies will contract to good companies. So you have to have that fundamental ethic, good set of values that are reaching out to those future visions and future challenges for our society. And good people will come and work for you. So I think there's so much we can do, and there's a lot that can be achieved in addressing those challenges.
Thank you. There are lots of interesting points there, Mick. I'm sure there's something else we'd all want to know, and that is, how did you navigate shareholders' interest in making money with the social and environmental responsibilities that you've outlined? And have we seen a shift in the commercial priorities from maximised profits to long-term sustainability of operations?
Yeah, well, like I've just said, the investors want to invest in good companies, and we've seen a significant shift towards investing in socially responsible companies, particularly in the last 20 years. And it's not just in resource companies, it's in more generally across the board. There's a new acronym called ESG, Environmental and Social Governance, which is being used by investors now to measure the performance of mining companies to meet sustainable development goals. And excuse me, this is a growing effort now. We've seen investors being particularly active when there's been breaches of these sustainable development goals, and a recent example with what happened with Rio Tinto is a very good case in point. This is growing momentum, and it is a great thing to happen, because it sort of links the financial world with the operating world where we in the mining industry are working. So sorry, I'll just finish there.
Yeah, okay, no, I have lots to come back to. I'm glad you flagged Rio Tinto, and some very significant points. Thank you very much. I'm going to look now to you, Jane, if I may. People tout electric vehicles as this great solution to the emissions produced by traditional vehicles, but what is the actual net improvement that EVs offer? Surely emissions are still created in the production of the vehicles, and how much of our electricity is still powered by coal?
Look, it's a great question, and I like to address that one first up, because it is a stumbling block for a lot of people when they're thinking about, why would I move to an EV? Is it any different? And I hear it quite a lot from both new customers thinking about moving across to electric vehicles and just members of the public that we're talking to anecdotally. And if we look on the one hand with internal combustion engine vehicles or conventional vehicles, they run off oil. And oil comes for us from the Middle East. It's almost all imported. About 90% of our oil's imported, and then it's refined in Asia. And that's a difference to how things used to be, because we did have more onshore production, but we gradually depleted the oil reserves that we've got, and we're closing a number of the refineries locally. And if we compare that to EVs, at the moment they're powered by electricity, which in Australia, you're quite right, is 76% at the moment is coal-fired power. So we burn coal to create electricity. About 24% is renewable sources of energy, and there's more and more of that coming on board. So you're weighing up those two competing interests. And I guess what I'd like to sort of say is that there's three really critical reasons that EVs make a difference even today. So even without all of those additional renewable sources of energy coming online. And the first and probably most important is human health. So there's an enormous advantage with electric vehicles to human health because they reduce air pollution. And we know from the World Health Organization that that remains one of the highest environmental hazards that they've identified that we need to reduce, because air pollution is associated with about 3 million premature deaths annually. And so what EVs do is they have no tailpipe emissions. The tailpipe emissions are zero, which is very different from an internal combustion engine vehicle where we produce nitrogen, sulphur, carbon, other contaminants and fine particulates. And so they contribute significantly to human health disadvantages and air pollution. And we can really see the significant difference that came to our cities during COVID when we suddenly had this clean air. And in large cities like London and Beijing and Delhi, you could see, and Sydney, you could see across the city during COVID as we had lockdown and significant less vehicles on the road. So there's this fantastic advantage to human health that's just immediate. The second part of your question, Anita, which is really interesting, which is lifetime emissions. And it's absolutely true to say that when you're building an EV, you actually use, EV stands for electric vehicle, you're actually using more energy in the manufacture, and that's partly because of the lithium-ion batteries that power EVs. So there's this initial early toll, which is slightly higher than a conventional vehicle, but even over the total cost of ownership and the total lifetime, whether that's 10 years or 12 years, there's a 17 to 30% benefit to running an electric vehicle. And that's because it is powered by electricity, and 24% of that's renewables, and the more low carbon energy that we use to power EVs, the better and better that's going to get. And as the technology improves, we're also going to see that the toll in emissions caused during manufacturing is going to come down further and further. And if we look at Elon Musk's latest development in battery technology, that's going to be a jump ahead already to reducing the energy and emissions that are used in that early stage. But I think the fundamental point being that even today, with the 24% of renewables that we have in Australia as energy sources, it's already 17 to 30% better to have an electric vehicle. And third, and perhaps the least important but also really significant for people who live on busy roads, is noise pollution. So they're significantly quieter if you live on the main street of a rural town, if you're a farmer who lives on a highway, if you live in a metro area, you get this very significant improvement to your quality of life in that you don't have big diesel trucks, buses, SUVs, V8s driving past with their very noisy engines. And increasingly we're seeing that heavy vehicles are potentially going to move to electrification rather than hydrogen as their source of energy. So there's this great improvement, which anecdotally people I know who've been in Copenhagen before COVID were saying it's just a very, very different environment. You can sit on a CBD street, you can have a cup of coffee, you can hear yourself speak, and there's this huge change to those busy areas where you can actually sit outside, assuming it reaches over 20 degrees in Copenhagen, and you can sit outside, but you can sit out there and enjoy your cup of coffee and just have a chat with friends. So great lifestyle improvements to people, and I think you described those informally, Anita, as people and the planet. So, great advantages on both of those fronts to people and the planet.
Thank you. I don't know if I'm the only person who's hearing for the first time some quite extraordinary statistics there in favour of moving to an EV. Jane, just moving on, people often think renewable energy and sustainability are areas where you spend money, not make it. How does this match up with your experience?
Yeah, look, Tritium's a really typical example of a startup. We're now at scale-up stage because we're plus 300 employees, but we follow what's really very typical for startups in the advanced technology industry, where if you have a competitive advantage, maybe you've got a new technology or you're tapping into sustainability or got the first mover advantage, what will initially happen is you'll have significant investment, whether that's angel investment or whether it's equity investment from large shareholders. And if you're onto something, you'll have exponential growth. So your CAGR will go absolutely through the roof, and year on year your growth will be huge. And to sustain that growth, you actually have to spend a significant amount of capital in growing facilities. If you're making hardware like we do, you need warehouse, distribution and manufacturing facilities. In fact, Tritium's invested very significantly in a test and certification facility right here in Brisbane, which will be a world first to be able to test up to 720 kilowatts, which is the highest in the world. So there'll be a facility right here in Brisbane which doesn't exist anywhere else in the world, and gives us this competitive advantage of being able to iterate on new technology more quickly and certify it more quickly than our competitors can. And that's always important if you're going to go global and be international, and if you're going to export. It doesn't matter if you make a tangible or an intangible product. So if you make an intangible product like software, you're likely to need to have salespeople in various regions across the world. If you make a tangible product, you'll need to have distribution and warehousing facilities and potentially manufacturing facilities around the world. So that investment needs to take place, and it has to be backed by investors initially. But at a certain point, the investors, and it's often 4 to 5 years in, will start to say, we're not going to keep refinancing this company till we see the path to profit. And at that point, they want you to tighten the purse strings and have an LRBP, a long-range business plan, which tells how you'll move to profit. And if you don't have that, you're not going to continue to succeed in getting funding. And some great examples of that, I would say Uber, when they ran their IPO, they had a very significant drop in their share price not long after their IPO, and that's because the shareholders couldn't see the path to profit with that company. But then on the other side of the fence, look at Tesla, which of course is a company that is in the sustainable industry. Tesla had an IPO 10 years ago, and their share price has increased 4,000% over that 10 years. And the reason for that is, even though they haven't had their first fully profitable year, I think they're very close, they've had 3/4 of profit, people see the path to profit. So their investors and shareholders look at the fundamentals of that business, and they say, this is a business that's got all of the fundamentals to become a hugely profitable business. So with a sustainable or green company, you're applying exactly the same lens that you would to any other investment that you make in business. You look at it with a critical eye and you say, what are the competitive advantages? What are the barriers to entry? Who are the executives? Do they have a track record? And you're making that assessment that you'd make with any investment. And Tritium, I think, is a really nice example of that. And I won't compare us with Tesla because they're probably a little bit more in the stratosphere than we are as yet. And obviously we're in the same industry, but we have all the great same fundamentals to turn to profit. One of the first things we've done is we've made a change in leadership, which the founders and the directors had a very careful think about 12 months ago. And they said, let's put in somebody like myself, who comes out of the commercialisation industry in a large global corporate like Boeing, have them focus on turning the company to profit, and then have the founders focus on, they're all PhDs in engineers, on cracking the atom on the technology, taking us forward as that key leader on the technology, and then bringing rapidly new products to market. And that's paid off for us in spades, in that last quarter was our first cash flow positive quarter, last quarter was our highest quarter ever in terms of revenue, and we're bringing new products to market next month and more again in 6 months. So those sorts of decisions need to be made. And then you look at us compared to Tesla, you've got all of the same fundamentals. Electrification's reached tipping point, huge amount of uptake of EVs, and so we now have facilities in Amsterdam, Los Angeles and Brisbane ready to take advantage of that huge amount of growth. And we're now one of the oldest companies in the industry because we've been there since it was a nascent industry. So we have 4,500 chargers in the field in 38 countries, and we have that history of being able to prove that we can service them, look after our customers, that they're reliable, and that engenders customer trust. So those are the fundamentals you're looking for. And with Tritium, I'm incredibly bullish that over the next 1 to 2 years, it's going to become a very highly profitable company.
So much there to unpack and discuss, Jane, but right now I need to turn to Debbie. Debbie, you worked at UQ from 1990 through to 2014 and then returned as our Vice-Chancellor in August this year. What are the changes that you've noticed in how the university approaches sustainability in the 30 years since you first came to UQ?
Well, thank you, Anita, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this really important panel. And it's great to have the opportunity to connect with UQ's community of changemakers all around the world. Well, sustainability is now such an important and all-encompassing topic. It will naturally mean different things to different people, but my understanding of what the term sustainability means has changed entirely compared to when I first arrived at UQ in 1990. Back then there was an awareness of global warming, as it was then called, but it hadn't yet become a really pressing mainstream global issue. Undoubtedly, and I know there was really important research that was being undertaken then at UQ into environmental and social issues, but I wouldn't say that sustainability was seen to be a really significant issue for the university at large back then. And as I think many of us know, environmental issues really started to be elevated through the 1990s. 1992 saw the Rio Earth Summit and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Also in 1992 here in Australia there was the formation of the Australian Greens as a federal political party. Bob Brown, the leader of the Greens, was then elected to the Australian Senate in 1996. And then lots and lots of milestones through the years, right up till 2016 with the Sustainable Development Goals being agreed and adopted, and also the Paris Agreement signed. So to answer your question, Anita, there's been a remarkable raising of society's awareness of sustainability issues over the past 30 years, as there should be. And that's reflected, I can tell you, here at the University of Queensland. As I think many of our listeners will know, we are a university that is absolutely committed to knowledge leadership for a better world for the future. And so sustainability is at the heart of most of what we now do. As a university, we're at the forefront of seeking solutions to a range of sustainability issues, and we've heard that wonderfully in the areas of biodiversity and conservation from Brooke, but we also have major programs in food security, water security, climate change, and all manner of other societal and environmental challenges that are linked to sustainability. If we look at our research institutes, our major research institutes, we've got the Sustainable Minerals Institute, we've got the Queensland Alliance for Agriculture and Food Innovation. And these two research institutes alone are playing critical roles in helping us to find more sustainable solutions to using Earth's resources. We've got our Global Change Institute. And in fact, when you consider our research programs right across the university, sustainability of resources, of the environment, of communities, that is a theme that runs through nearly all of them. If you look at our teaching programs, sustainability is now a core issue right across the many disciplines and professions that we teach. If you look at how we operate as a major business essentially here, a major institution here in Queensland, sustainability is something that absolutely drives a lot of what we do. So huge changes over the past 30 years.
There's certainly many changes there, Debbie, massive changes. If we look now at the university as corporate, what are some of the ways that UQ is committed to sustainability?
Yeah, and that follows on, really nicely from my initial comments. And I do want to obviously pay credit to my predecessor, Professor Peter Hoy, previous Vice-Chancellor, who really took a leadership position when it came to taking action on these issues. So solar energy, we've got major investments as a university at Warwick and at Gatton. Under Peter's leadership, UQ effectively, what we did was to reduce our carbon footprint to net zero. One of Peter's final acts as VC was to open UQ's 64 megawatt Warwick solar farm. So that means that we are the first university in the world to produce 100% of our electrical energy needs from our own assets. More importantly, it's a really good facility for research and teaching in relation to renewables. It's a way in which we demonstrate. That's what universities often do. We're often able to demonstrate what the future looks like. Prior to that, back in 2015, we opened our 3.3 megawatt Gatton solar research facility on our Gatton campus, which really enabled us to better understand the cost efficiencies of solar technology, to research ways to improve the integration of solar energy into the grid, and to pave the way for larger scale solar systems such as we now have at Warwick. But there's other evidence of our commitment to clean energy innovation, and it's become gradually more visible across all of our campuses. 2016, we had 4 solar-powered electric vehicle chargers installed at our St Lucia campus and at Gatton. 2020, we flicked the switch on a Tesla battery system, one of the largest behind-the-meter power storage systems in Queensland. Next year, we're planning to add 2 hydrogen-powered buses to our fleet, and they'll be in operation in 2022. And the buses will run on hydrogen that will be produced using electrolysis, using renewable power from our Gatton solar farm. These will replace 2 diesel-powered buses that currently run between our St Lucia campus and our Gatton campus. And that's with support from the Queensland Government's Hydrogen Industry Development Fund. And I'll just leave with a third example. Our Dow Centre for Sustainable Engineering, we run what's called our Rapid Switch program. We led the formation of this program, but it's multinational, it's cross-disciplinary, and it's aimed at helping the world transition away from fossil fuels. Our partners include Princeton University, Tsinghua University in China, IIT Bombay and IIT Delhi, so these are major institutes of technology in India. And by bringing together this diverse expertise, the Rapid Switch project team is looking behind the technological and engineering issues to consider the commercial, the political and the policy issues that could prolong or derail the transition to a sustainable future. And that's the approach that we all need to take to solving these big, complex global challenges. We know to do that we need a combination of international partnerships, we need industry partnerships, and we need to bring multidisciplinary expertise to bear on these huge issues. And the university, I think, is one of the major players in this space. We won't do it alone, we'll do it in partnership. But again, it demonstrates our commitment to ensuring that we have an impact and we leave the world in a better place for future generations.
Well, there's certainly a significant list of achievements and commitments there, Debbie. Thank you for sharing those. I just want to turn back over to Brazil and Brooke. Brooke, from your experience in the field as it currently stands, what does the future hold for us and our environment?
So the science, as we all know, is pretty clear that we are running out of time. We're tracking in the wrong direction in terms of species loss, ecological degradation and climate change, with our current trajectories of greenhouse gas emissions tracking close to the worst case scenarios that have been modelled by scientists. But I'm sure a lot of us know about all of these trends, and David Attenborough's latest documentary gives a pretty clear summary of this. I'm sure a lot of us have seen it. But if these trends continue unabated, it means that in the future we'll increasingly experience extreme natural events like the mega fires that occurred around the world this year, which in turn affect the economy as damages have to be paid for. Changing conditions means that agricultural suitability will shift, so we'll need to change our food production systems. Some places will experience water crises, while some locations might be met with too much water, for example, through flooding or sea level rise. Increasing ocean acidification means it will be difficult for many marine species to survive, further affecting our food supply chains. And human health will likely be affected in many ways, which Jane touched on before. And scientists have even started drawing the links between humanity pushing further into those intact landscapes and the increase in new diseases that may emerge as we uncover these new environments. In a recent study that I led as part of my PhD, we tracked humanity's footprints over terrestrial Earth over a 13-year period. And we analysed these results. And we found that currently about 58% of Earth's terrestrial surface is under intense human pressure. So as a result, the degradation in these places can't be easily reversed if it's at all possible. And we found that in just that 13-year period, close to 2 million square kilometres of relatively intact land, that's land that's still in relatively good condition, became modified by us. So that's an area almost the size of Mexico. And that's really worrying because these intact ecosystems are really important for providing habitats to species. They store a lot of carbon to help mitigate climate change. And they provide us with other services like fresh water and clean air. So these results are certainly shocking, but there is another side to that coin. So through studies like mine, we also know that where those really key intact places are on Earth that we just can't afford to lose. So we are running out of time, but with transformative change, it's still not too late to turn things around and head on a more sustainable path. So at a global level, we really need to take the scientific evidence that's available and use it to protect those really important biodiverse intact areas, sustainably manage the human-dominated landscapes, and restore the really degraded areas. And if actions like these can be scaled up globally, quickly and effectively, they can make a huge difference.
Thank you, Brooke. You're right. This is certainly an issue that needs serious attention. Perhaps involving Indigenous peoples in future plans would be beneficial, as they have been stewards of the earth for tens of thousands of years, and there's much Indigenous knowledge largely left untapped or ignored. Right now, I just wanted to throw that out there, but right now, Mick, I've got another question for you. Extractive industries like gold mining are a key market in Australia, markets that we all rely on and that have been poised as the solution for Australia's economic recovery. A lot of people advocate for the halting or winding back of extractive industries due to their environmental impact. I'd like to know what you would say to that.
Well, Anita, we just can't stop mining our resources because we rely on those materials in our day-to-day life. We rely on copper for the transmission of electricity, we rely on nickel to produce stainless steel that we use in all of our household goods. And indeed, we actually need coal, metalliferous coal, to make steel. There is no other way to make steel as we know it, and as we know it today. So it is fundamental to the society that we currently live in. And we do need those materials. In fact, the solution includes those materials for the future, such as copper and nickel and cobalt and lithium, which are all mined from the ground other than what is recycled. So the mining of our resources can be and should be part of the solution. And another reason is you can't just shut these industries down because there are large communities that rely on the resources sector for jobs. The economies of towns and even our own state here in Queensland has a large reliance on the resource sector. In fact, Australia is the biggest exporters of our resources, and we enjoy a high standard of living because of that. And you can't just shut that down. You have to. So there has to be a transformation. transforming to a transition, I should say, to a new future where those economies are sustained, those jobs are sustained, and people are trained in different roles. A good example I've had in my career is when I worked in Laos about 20 years ago, built what was effectively the first modern mining operation in the country. It became, within 3 or 4 years, it became 15% of the GDP of that country. Now, it is the 5th smallest country in the world, but nonetheless this was a very significant operation for not just the local communities around Laos, but also the whole country and the economy of the country. And for us to just turn that off in a heartbeat would have caused a lot of hardship and reintroduce extreme poverty. Remember, poverty exists all over the world. We are the privileged few. We are the privileged few that enjoy a high standard of living, largely because of our investments in community and the resources that we've extracted. But the majority of people around the world live in poverty, and they live from day to day. And those people are got to be part of the future as well. So there has to be a transition period where we've set these goals. I talked about the Sustainable Development Goals for 2050. We need a strategy of how to get there. And we can get there through people, through the right investment by corporate and by government, and through research and development and investment in technology.
Thanks, Mick. Jane, if, as Mick says, changes need to be thoughtful and sustainable and we need strategies, obviously, what about electric vehicles? Data from the Electric Vehicle Council shows EV sales tripled in 2019, but they still comprise only 0.6% of the Australian market versus, for example, 15% in the Netherlands. Realistically, when can we expect to see Australians fully embracing electric vehicles, and what would the actual environmental impact be? And I know you've already touched on it previously, but if you could talk a little bit more to that, please.
Yeah, look, I love this question because, I feel like I'm on Mythbusters, in answering it, in that there definitely are some myths that we do need to bust about why there's been a low uptake in Australia. And I think you mentioned, Anita, 15% in the Netherlands, 56% of new cars in Norway are now electric vehicles, 26% in Iceland are electric vehicles. And there's different drivers for those. So if we look at, say, Norway and Iceland, they have 95 and 99% hydroelectric power. So there's this great economic driver for those countries to be fully self-sustaining, to stop importing oil and to be reliant on this plentiful hydroelectric power that they've got and to consume that power, and they've actually even got more left over for export. So that started them on this path many years ago, about 20 years ago, because they had this great economic imperative and driver, which is different in every country that you're in and is certainly different in Australia. So if we look at Australia, we're well behind at 0.6% of the fleet. If we look at the rest of the developed world, they're at 2.5 to 5% of the fleet. So Australia's lagging. And there are these myths that the lagging in Australia is because we're this sort of vast open country. It's very difficult to get infrastructure right across the country, and there's range anxiety. That's one of the things that I hear a lot. But actually the infrastructure's already ahead of EV uptake now. So you can now drive from Tasmania up to Cape York, right up the east coast, and you can go all the way. The cars have ranges now of 350 to 400 kilometres. So if you go to a fast DC charger on the highway and they're all the way along, you can get 350 kilometres of range in 10 minutes. And the Queensland Eureka Highway is a great example of that, runs up and down the east coast of Queensland. The Victorian city councils have put them right through Victoria, and in fact there's a bid on foot right now for another 17 of those through regional Victoria. Tasmania, great country, great state to have EV charging right across the state in that discrete area that they have to drive around. So the infrastructure's there. The range anxiety shouldn't be there. I'm not sure that there's too many of us who want to drive right through the Nullarbor. Most of us want to go to Noosa, the Gold Coast, maybe Melbourne, at a stretch, the Daintree. And that can all be done in an EV now. So let's move away from the thought that it's range anxiety or there's not enough infrastructure. The government actually has invested in infrastructure, and then there's private organisations like GoEV, ChargeFox, JetCharge who've also invested in this charging infrastructure right across Australia, including the West Coast and also South Australia. So the fundamental issue from all of the research shows that government policy drives EV uptake. And the reason for that is because there's a high upfront price to purchase the car. It's higher than an internal combustion engine vehicle, and that puts it out of the range of the average ordinary family to be able to buy one as their car or even their second car. The cheapest ones are around $43,000 for an MG. It's about $54,000 for a Hyundai Ioniq. It's about $70,000 for the Tesla Model 3, and they're just too expensive. So you have to lower that cost via tax incentives or some type of policy that leads to price parity. And that's exactly what happened in Norway. They took the VAT off, which was 25%, and that brought about price parity. So there's a few things we advocate at the federal level. From a taxation perspective, you could remove the luxury vehicle tax. That would have a huge and immediate impact on uptake, be very rapid. You could look at GST. That would also have a very large impact on rapid uptake. And there's other levers at the state government level with stamp duty and registration that you could use to help with that price parity. Very much like solar. Solar didn't take off until government got involved and said they wanted more solar power, and they were going to help subsidise the initial uptake of solar, and that's what led to the uptake by your average Australian in buying solar power. So, if we look at that, Australians generally are early adopters of new technology. We like new technology, consumers, more so than businesses and the private sector, public sector. It's much harder for them to bring about change, but consumers love to adopt new tech. And I think Australians would take that up in spades if it was affordable and if we had government policies in place that encouraged that uptake. And then at some point what happens is the industry becomes self-sustaining and you can remove all of those subsidies, and that usually occurs at around 20% of the fleet. So if you set a target and say, for example, we'd like to get to 20% of the fleet being electric vehicles, you can then remove all of those subsidies and incentives, and you've got this self-sustaining industry, and that comes partly from having second-hand vehicles on the market that become more affordable, fleet vehicles being sold second-hand, and they're more affordable. So those are the things that need to occur. Absolutely all of the research will show that it's government policy driven at this stage. Otherwise it's going to take longer because the vehicles will need to come down in cost and be competitive with internal combustion engine vehicles before we see that change. And the second part of your question, Anita, which is really about the what would happen tomorrow if the fleet was all EVs in passenger vehicles? Would the grid be able to cope? Absolutely not. So if every vehicle tomorrow, 80% of Australian cars were drawing down power from the grid, we'd need to double the power infrastructure. But the way it does work is that if 80% of vehicles tomorrow changed to electric vehicles and they did smart charging, the current grid could cope with it as is. And the reason that works is smart charging via an app. So you plug your car in at night, usually overnight at home, sometimes during the day at work, and your app will work with the retailer to say, prices are really high now, don't charge, prices have come down, do charge, and your car will be doing that all night, picking the times at which it should charge and then evening out the impact on the grid. So, that could work tomorrow.
Wow, I'm personally enthused to see people like you, Jane, championing such an important shift in our transport culture from within the industry, and I'm looking forward to you getting the government, both at state and federal level, on board ASAP. If I can now throw to Debbie, how important are industry partnerships for UQ in terms of translating some of university's groundbreaking research into new products or outcomes that have an impact on sustainability?
Thanks, Anita. And as I alluded to before, industry partnerships are absolutely critical. They're not only critical for sustainability and all of the work we're doing in that area, but much more broadly, I think for our economy. It's well known that Australia, and I'm talking now more broadly than UQ, punches well above its weight in terms of what might be referred to as discovery science. Australian universities have been responsible for some really amazing inventions. IVF, the bionic ear, spray on skin, and of course from UQ, the cervical cancer vaccine. So today, and if you think about Australia, we're just 0.3% of the world's population, but we produce around 4% of the world's research outputs, publications, major books, etc. And our universities are recognised across the world as being powerhouses for research. But when we look at industry engagement, industry partnership, innovation more broadly, we don't rank so highly. So clearly what we need to do is to do more to ensure that our homegrown inventions are being translated here in Australia into new products and new services that have a commercial impact or have a societal impact or have a clinical impact, and that's something that we're very committed to at UQ, but it's also a big focus for the Australian government as they plot a path for Australia to economic recovery following the pandemic, and I think universities play a critical role in that pathway to recovery. In the recent budget, for instance, the government allocated billions to R&D and to research translation. For instance, there's $1.5 billion to support the modern manufacturing strategy. Now, R&D and commercialisation is seen to be a key part of that strategy. It's got 6 priority areas, just 6, and one of them is recycling and clean energy. Also $1.4 billion to support R&D, research and development, for low emission technologies and other funding allocations. So it's a very clear government focus now, and there's funding to encourage, incentivise university industry collaboration and to drive greater innovation in our economy. That's good for our economy, it's good for our social prosperity, and it's good for our work on sustainability. At UQ, we're really lucky to have our own commercialisation arm, and that's UniQuest, and many of you will know that UniQuest is clearly and regarded across the board as being the leading technology transfer company in Australia. UniQuest is constantly out in the market seeking industry partners to work with the university on commercial development of our research projects, and many of these have environmental benefits. And if I just give one example, it's a startup called Pure Battery Technologies. The company is developing more efficient ways to produce battery materials, and so the research that led to the startup is based on a process that extracts nickel and cobalt minerals from low-grade ores and converts them into battery materials more effectively and at lower cost. Now, our researchers involved in this are Associate Professor James Vaughan and Dr. Will Hawker from our engineering faculty. But many of our researchers are involved in breakthrough ideas like this. And what we want to do is to translate more of them, commercialise more of them, so that we've got the technology to help us reduce waste, to lighten our carbon footprint, and to ensure that we can live more sustainably on planet Earth.
Thank you, Debbie. Partnerships are vital, as you say, particularly between the university and other organisations. And I'm just wondering now if perhaps, Brooke, you might, for the members of the UQ ChangeMaker community, suggest some tangible actions that will reduce our environmental footprint as individuals. We heard some great examples from those beautiful children in the introduction video.
Yeah, so in addition to everything that the kids said, and of course you touched on better drawing on Indigenous knowledge, that's really important as well. So there's a whole suite of actions that we can do, but I want to make 3 key suggestions which I think are really important and relevant right now. So the first one is that myth out there that it's either jobs and economy or a healthy environment. So I think if you hear someone say that, we really need to call it out, because it's not true, and it's just a bit of a false dichotomy. And just because changing the way that we currently do things is complicated doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. And in fact, we don't really have much of a choice now. So every time we spend money, we're dictating the narrative of the planet. So I think it's really important to find out the values of the companies that we buy from and investigate how their products are made. And also, I think it's important to save and invest your money with banks and funds that don't fund fossil fuel extraction or other damaging activities. And we all invest through super, so investigating those different super funds is really important, because there are sustainable alternatives out there which invest your money more ethically. And as shareholders and consumers, we have a lot of power, as Mick touched on. So it's our responsibility to drive change that way. So the second thing, I think it's really important that we all take the time to educate ourselves about the issues that we care about and try to pay attention only to scientific or reputable sources. So I'm sure we've all seen by now the Netflix documentary Social Dilemma and Kevin Rudd's biggest ever online petition about media bias. And Malcolm Turnbull was on Q&A the other day talking about this. So I think this global shift that we're seeing towards people believing misinformation and not trusting science anymore is going to be extremely problematic in the future. And I think it's something we all need to overcome through better education. And finally, possibly the most controversial statement of the night is, I think the best thing you can do for the environment is to go vegan, vegetarian, or at least eat a little bit less meat, because if the whole world went vegan, global farmland use could be reduced by more than 75%, which is an area equivalent to the US, China, the European Union, and Australia combined. So that's a lot of land that you could use for other things, such as restoring natural vegetation to help combat climate change. And to end all of that on a positive note, innovation and technology, of course, is crucial to solving some of these sustainability challenges. But currently, there's no real technological or scientific limitation preventing us from living sustainably. It's all political, so we could stop any further climate change or ecological degradation pretty quickly if there was the will. So it's not an impossible challenge. And I think it gets back a little bit to what Jane was talking about with political policies driving the change. I just saw this morning in a Guardian article that they've put a new tax on EV, electric vehicles, in South Australia, which doesn't seem to make sense. So yeah, I think trying to drive policy in the right direction is absolutely crucial.
Well, thanks, Brooke. You've given us a range of actions we can implement ourselves that can collectively make a huge difference. And I would have been disappointed if you didn't suggest we all become vegans. I think most of us can do a day or two or 4 a week without meat, so thank you for that. And no pun intended, I guess, with driving policy. Anyway, now would be the perfect time to take some questions from our viewers. Our first question is from Suzanne, one of our wonderful alumni, who asks, how can we enlighten more workplace leaders and community members to the idea that there is more to sustainability than solar panels and recycling programs? Perhaps, Jane, you might tackle that one.
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Suzanne. And, it leads back actually to the point that Brooke just made about what's just happened in South Australia, and it's a little bit cart before the horse, because you can put in place those things that are designed ultimately to support the fact that when EVs come onto the road, they need to be paid for. But first you have to have the incentive in place to get the EVs onto the road. So I think that's a little bit cart before the horse, and it's a good point that you made, Brooke. But I think, again, if we're going to try and influence both workplace leaders and the community, the best way to do that, again, is by government-led policy. Government has to lead that, because what they do for industry and for the community is set these long-term policies where you're thinking 10, 15, even 20 years ahead, and the Queensland Government actually has a number of 10 or 20-year roadmaps in areas like aerospace, defence, advanced technology, and those give confidence to both business and the community to make decisions which are very significant for them in terms of bringing about a change in their lives or in their business which costs them money, and they need to know that that's going to be supported by government. So if, for example, you want to buy an EV, you need to know that there'll be infrastructure in place, that the government supports you in that decision that you've made to pick up that change. And a really great example of that is if we look at California's laws, where they've instituted a law that by 2035 there'll be no passenger cars which are emitting emissions. They all need to be electrified passenger cars. And what that does is set a 15-year time limit where you can make secure decisions about the fact that when you upgrade your car, it should be an electric vehicle, that the government will also back you in that because they're going to look after you from an infrastructure perspective. And it's a push-pull process. So the push in California, which works on big business, is if you're a polluter that produces carbon dioxide, there's a cap and trade system. And under that system, you need to buy credits at auction from the state. And then the push is the incentives that sit there to encourage people to do these things. And with that carrot and stick approach, you can get to where you get to, and you can also have these fantastic security for people in making the decisions, that it's the right decision and they won't be left with a piece of obsolete technology. They haven't bought the beta video, they bought the VHS video. Well, in fact, that became obsolete as well, so it's probably not a great example. but you've bought the future technology that's going to last you for sort of 10 to 15 years. And we've had a great example of how that worked, really well with one of our major customers in California, SSA Marine, and they run global ports around the world. And we'd all know that ports are one of our biggest polluters. They run heavy vehicles, they run ships, and they actually have a lot of pollution. And SSA Marine, on the basis of this cap and trade system and also this upcoming 2035 end to passenger vehicles, has made a promise that by 2035 they won't have any trucks that produce greenhouse gas emissions. And that gives them 15 years to have a staggered work toward that, where they'll test. Right now they're testing electric vehicles and electric chargers. They've got small trucks which are electrified, and they'll continue to progress that now over a 15-year period on the basis of the government's promise. And ultimately it'll be good for them because they'll have these more reliable vehicles which are actually cheaper over the total cost of ownership. So I believe it's a push and pull process. It does need to be led by government, and business actually wants to support sustainability. Most of their staff are very motivated by being involved in things which benefit the environment. It's a great sense of mission and morale builder within an organisation, but you do need to have something in place to motivate the business to get there. If they don't have that motivation to bring about significant change, to make the investment that's necessary to make the significant change, then they're not necessarily going to do it on their own.
Thank you, Jane. Our next question is from Lindsay, who asks, how can the government response to COVID-19 guide the response to tackling climate change and sustainability? Mick, would you like to take that one?
Oh, thanks, Anita. Yeah, look, I think we all agree that electrification of our transport systems and our society is the right path. But that means we need to power that with a lower carbon footprint. And I think what the government can do with the economy sort of dragging its heels now, the setback from the COVID-19 pandemic, they can pump prime the economy through investment in the infrastructure that will generate more power or baseload power that has a lower carbon footprint. So things like gas power stations, peaking power stations that can come on when demand is very high, when we've all got our stoves on between 6 and 8 in the evening, can be a very effective way to provide that power when there's high demand and the sun is not shining or the wind's not blowing. Another example is pumped hydro, where you're using gravity to basically store electricity and then release that energy when you've got peak power load situations or in the middle of the evening. So I think there is an opportunity for the government to invest more in infrastructure to provide more cleaner power for Australia, and that will directly benefit our economy because it'll provide jobs, it'll provide an injection of funds into communities and ease the pain currently being suffered by many companies and people around the country.
Great, thanks Mick. Our final question tonight is from Kim, who would like to know how can we bridge the knowledge gap in a polarised world? And Debbie, perhaps you would be able to answer this one.
Yes, no, very, very happy to, and thank you, Kim. It's a very good question, and this is a very challenging issue, I think, as Brooke articulated so well at the beginning of this panel. There really is broad consensus, not only on the science of climate change within the scientific community, but on some of the solutions as well. But what we need to do is to bring about change where there is broad acceptance of what the challenge is and what the solutions are. Now we know that a big part of the problem is that misinformation or conspiracy can spread very quickly through our media channels, particularly social media, and that feeds into some of the very polarised communities that we see, and they've often got diametrically opposed perspective. And this dynamic is really contributing, I think, to what's often called the post-truth world that we live in today, where scientific facts and evidence can become highly contested. And I think for me this really does reinforce the vital role that universities play in terms of being environments, bastions where evidence is something that is highly valued, where we debate issues, where we bring to the fore what the facts are, what the evidence is, and there is absolutely more that we can do as institutions to our scientists, our researchers out there in the community to speak up for evidence, to speak up for scientific facts, to speak up for truth. And Brooke has done a wonderful example of that here today, as have the rest of our panellists. But one of the encouraging things that did come out of the pandemic, has come out of the pandemic, I think, is the increasing standing and profile of our leading researchers, our leading scientists who have helped to inform and guide our public health response. Our academics and our scientific experts have been in the media every day this year offering valuable advice to our community, to our governments about how to protect ourselves, protect our communities and our families. So, given how well Australia has done in suppressing the virus based on this advice, I hope that this respect for science, this respect for evidence, this respect for expertise will linger around beyond the pandemic. And I think if we can elevate those voices, elevate the respect for those voices, then we can bridge the knowledge gap.
Excellent answer there, Debbie. Thank you. And thank you everyone for your thoughtful responses, and of course to our alumni for all the great questions we received. Can't go through them all, sorry. Before we start wrapping up tonight, for all of you watching, I've got a call to action. You all logged on this evening because you care. You know the situation we are currently facing, and you know that if things don't change, the world we leave behind will be very different to the one we're living in today. Well, that change is up to us. Wherever you are in the world, whatever you do, however it is you live your life, there are ways you can make a difference. Sustainability is a choice, and a choice we should all be making. Tonight, I'm asking you to make your commitment to sustainability by taking the ChangeMaker pledge, declaring your one action for a more sustainable future. Before we hear from the panellists on their ChangeMaker pledge, I'd like to offer mine. Well, I've got two since this morning. I pledge to further commit to slow fashion, like this jacket, which I have on tonight. I actually picked up at an op shop in Brisbane. And I'm going to eat meat once a week. Brooke, let's hear from you first. What would your first pledge be in a sentence?
Thanks, Anita. So my ChangeMaker pledge is to look for more opportunities to better integrate academia with local government, local or governmental initiatives so that my science can be used to better inform actions on the ground and have a little bit more relevance beyond the academic sphere.
Great, thank you. And Mick, what would your ChangeMaker pledge be in a sentence?
My ChangeMaker pledge is to reduce consumption and wastage and invest in a lower carbon footprint for my home.
Awesome. And Jane?
Look, as the CEO of a company that's in e-mobility, it would be remiss of me not to look at my second car. So the first car is a work-provided Model 3 Tesla. But my home car is a hybrid Lexus, and I think I just can't continue to drive around in an ICE vehicle at this point, so it'd have to be move the second car to an EV.
Thank you. And Debbie, to finish off with our Vice-Chancellor, what's your ChangeMaker pledge?
Well, my ChangeMaker pledge in one sentence, and I'm going to use two bits to the one sentence, obviously in my role as Vice-Chancellor, to ensure that this issue remains absolutely centre stage in everything we do as a university. But personally, I'm going to be a bit like Mick. I think it's solar at home. I think I need to do more with my husband in having a low carbon footprint for our home.
Well, some great pledges there from our panellists. And unfortunately, that brings us to the end of our discussion this evening. I'd like to thank Brooke, Mick, Jane and Debbie for their time, as well as all our alumni from around the world who tuned in to listen. Please take the opportunity now to share your ChangeMaker pledge on your social media networks. Make sure you tag us at UQ Alumni and use the hashtag UQChangeMakers, and we'll be sharing them with our community. If you check your inboxes tomorrow, you will find an email profiling other UQ Changemakers leading in the sustainability space, as well as opportunities to network with like-minded alumni and be part of the wider ChangeMaker network. Thank you everyone for your time tonight, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening or perhaps morning, wherever you are in the world. Good night.